I wanted to talk about your film Right Between Your Ears. I know so many of us have beliefs, not about a date when the world would end, but about other things that, if tested or proven to be untrue, are difficult for us to let go of. So in his case, Harold Camping believed that the rapture would happen on the 21st of May and that the final destruction of the world would be, it would end in a gulf of fire.
That's right, yeah. The world would finally be destroyed by fire on the 21st of October of the same year, yeah.
Hi, Sheila. Welcome to the Ideology podcast. I am so thrilled that we finally get to do this.
It's great to see you after so long. I admire what you're doing. So, yeah, it's good to be here. What a privilege.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to talk about your film, Right Between Your Ears. Your film explores how beliefs are turned into certainties, how we all mistake our beliefs for truth. It's a film about a group of people convinced that the world would end on the 21st of May, 2011, a date that was predicted by a pastor called Harold Camping in California.
Yeah, I mean, he wouldn't call himself a pastor because I think theologically he'd come to the conclusion that God was no longer in the churches. So actually, as Christians, what people needed to do was just to read the Bible at home. And he was, a Bible teacher, no better than anyone, no better than anyone else. Because he devoted a lot of his life since retiring at the age of 35, because he was a very successful businessman. He sort of spent his life studying the Bible and therefore, devoted his time to family radio, which was a broadcasting studios, and they had a radio station where people could call in and they could kind of discuss ideas.
I know so many of us have beliefs, not about a date when the world would end, but about other things that, if tested or proven to be untrue, are difficult for us to let go of. So in his case, Harold Camping believed that the rapture would happen on the 21st of May and that the final destruction of the world, which would be, it would end in a gulf of fire.
That's right, yeah. The world would finally be destroyed by fire on the 21st of October of the same year, yeah.
For people who don't know what the rapture is, can you tell us a little bit about it? I have Christian friends who talk about the concept, but I don't think I fully understood it.
Yeah. So the rapture for Harold Camping and his believers would be a time where people, the chosen, would be taken up to heaven to be with God forever. And, his particular brand of or understanding of Christianity meant that the chosen could be people who were Christians, but they could equally be people who were atheists or Muslim. So, so amongst the kind of believers, people who believed in this date and who would identify as Christians, actually there was quite a bit of uncertainty and a bit of sort of anxiety. People hoped that they would be one of the chosen. But yeah. So the rapture is that the idea that the chosen would be taken up to heaven to be with God.
What would the chosen have had to have done to be one of the chosen?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think most Christians believe that it's not by what we do, but it's by believing in Jesus, and Jesus kind of took our place for our wrongdoing, and there's actually nothing that we could do to be the perfect person to be chosen by God. And so God himself came down, from as Christ, to be one of us, to die in our place. And so most Christians believe not in works, trying to be a good person, but actually believing in Jesus. And once we have that reconciliation with God, he changes our heart and changes our attitudes so that we begin to behave differently and live differently. But the kind of brand of Christianity that Harold Camping believed in was based on the idea that actually, if you choose to believe in Jesus, then that's a work, and that actually you can't choose to believe in God to be accepted by him, but he has to choose you. And that kind of choice, I mean, maybe from our perspective might be a little bit random, because you could, according to them, you could be a Muslim, you could be an atheist, you could be a Christian. You just had to have been chosen by God. And what kind of metric, God uses to kind of choose somebody, was not necessarily explicit.
Right. That's really interesting, because after watching the film, I assumed that the reason why people, and actually the people who came to believe in the date that he predicted, are not people that you would assume would fall for these types of beliefs. They included a stock trader, a philosophy student, a retail manager, could be any one of us, And so I assumed that maybe it was a time of deep uncertainty. There was the financial crash that had happened and all of these things. And so this was their way of having a sense of security in something, But what you're saying is very different. You're saying that actually they had no way of knowing if they would be part of the group that is part of the rapture.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think people were drawn to Harold Camping because he was very simple. So he wasn't kind of, there were people from, there were all sorts of people, but the people that we met, some people were from like maybe a Roman Catholic background, and they were used to a vicar, a priest telling them about God and doing confession. So the priest being a little bit of a mediator, sort of between them and God. And them not really necessarily reading the Bible a lot for themselves. And on the other hand, you had people who might have come from, maybe mega churches where you've got, big personalities, and maybe sometimes there would be a lot of glitz and maybe a lot of money involved. And so they were drawn to Harold Camping and Family Radio because it was very simple. Harold Camping was a simple guy, married to the same woman for, I think in the end, like 70 years. He wore very simple suits from Walmart, that he bought 10 years ago. His car was from the 80s, so very simple. And he would tell people, don't believe me, look at the Bible and look at the Bible for yourself. Try and don't follow me, but try and understand these things for yourself. But of course, he would be, he had, through the open forum, this program that he had, people could call in and ask questions. And so, so you had different people who had a Christian faith who were attracted to him or Family Radio, because it wasn't about money and it wasn't about glitz. It was about simple people wanting to live out their faith in a very authentic way. So when he came out with this belief that May 21 was going to be the rapture, and the beginning of the end of the world, a lot of people were like, 1 minute, hang on, this is maybe a step too far. But because they'd been listening to him for maybe 10, 15 or however many years, and it was quite standard and nothing sort of flashy or odd about what he was teaching, maybe they thought, okay, well, we've been able to listen to him, this is the first time he's come up with something, so let's just look into it, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. And because all the numbers sort of did add up and all of the ideas kind of did come together, they thought that was enough for them to believe. It was something like the philosophy student says in the film, you could look at it and it fit together. You could make sense of it. So in a way, it made a kind of sense, but in reality, it wasn't true because it didn't happen.
Right. So in a way, then it is the same thing, isn't it? There's a sense of security that you can get in a time of turmoil when all around you people had lost their houses and there was so much uncertainty around that time. He was offering the alternative, which is just concentrate on your faith and believe that you will be one of the chosen ones, right? And just know that God will come through for you. So it provided that.
Well, to be honest, those people were not looking for security. They felt secure, in their Christian, and this was something else that had just come up. So they weren't looking for it. It was just like it came up, and because we could believe him, he seemed to be a sound teacher before, then we can look into this. But they weren't kind of like people who were insecure, who had been knocked by the financial crisis or anything. They were just people wanting to live out their, simple Christian faith. And this came up, and they were like, well, if it's true, then we need to believe in it. And if we believe in it, then actually we're going to be living life a little bit differently, because maybe if I'm chasing money in the stock market, that's not the best use of the time left that I have. I actually need to warn people, and I need to tell people what's going on. So, we've got this analogy of the pyramid that the social psychologists bring up, that once you go along with believing something or not believing something, you will take steps in line with those beliefs, and you will do actions that you will then have to justify. And so you've got you have some believers who, okay, I'm going to go along with believing this. Then they might have a few car stickers. They might kind of give out a few leaflets. Then they might kind of quit their job, like one of our contributors did. She was like, well, if I believe in this, then actually I need to kind of quit my job, because there's no point in working. I need to kind of be out there and make the most of my life, and kind of tell people. And so the more you do, the more you will say, well, I'm not a stupid person. This is true. Therefore, the action that I've done, I can justify. And so so the things that we do in line with our beliefs, we will justify, and oftentimes maybe end up having stronger beliefs and doing bigger steps in line with that belief, and sometimes ending very far from where we started. So I'm sure at the beginning, nobody thought that they would end up quitting their jobs or going on Hollywood and Highland, in the middle of Los Angeles, giving leaflets about the end of the world. They probably didn't imagine that they would end up doing things like that.
Can you talk to us about that pyramid that the psychologists use to explain how we come to hold these rigid beliefs?
Yeah. So at the top of the pyramid, you've basically got a choice to make. Are you going to believe? Are you going to break up from this, relationship or not? Are you going to cheat in this exam or not? Are you going to believe in the end of the world or not? And basically, once you take a step, let's say, to believe in the end of the world, you will then embark on on actions according to that belief that you will then justify. And there's a possibility that the more actions that you take, the more you will need to justify those actions. And there's a possibility that you will become sort of deeper in what you do in alliance with your belief. And because you're kind of continuing to justify that, you can very much end up very far from where you thought you would be originally. So for our believers, okay, yeah, I can believe in this. I might give out a few leaflets. To I'm going to actually quit my job, because there's no point in me working. I'm going to make a very public statement on Hollywood and Highland in Los Angeles, wearing t-shirts, giving out leaflets, having banners that people need to be warned about the end of the world. And so a lot of the believers sort of went from just looking into it and then believing it, and then sort of making quite in some cases dramatic steps in line with that belief.
Yeah. So then that it brings us to the polarized world that we live in. What made you want to make this film at that time?
Yeah, so for a long time, my friend and colleague is a neuroscientist, and we've been discussing for a long time about how to, there's so much great knowledge and information in kind of science, and how can we bring those to a wider public through storytelling? And for a long time, he in particular was interested in how in important debates or conversations that people have that are close to their heart, how difficult it is, maybe how impossible it is to really communicate with people from different views. Oftentimes you don't talk to somebody, you're talking at them, you're talking beyond them, and why is that? How do we relate to our beliefs? And so there was an article actually in a newspaper that he came across about this group of people in America who had become convinced about a date for the end of the world. And he got in touch with me and another colleague and was like, it would be amazing to see what was going on in these people's heads, him being a neuroscientist. And I said, well, why don't we make a film about it? And so that was the journey. You had these people who believed in something that was very far from what most people believe. And so it wasn't necessarily a very, it wasn't kind of political, like maybe climate change or another subject that is very divisive. And they kind of inadvertently set up a test of their belief, which was this date, and, would the end of the world begin or would it not? And so it would be very clear whether they were right or wrong in their prediction. So that was the genesis of the idea. And when we went out, we very much kind of had to suspend our disbelief and kind of really just respect and accept people for where they were at, and the journey they had come along.
Yeah. So you kind of took an observational, distant approach where you just followed them, right? You just followed them in their journey.
Yeah, we followed them, but we asked questions. What does it mean to believe? In this stuff. How did you come to believe it? There were quite a lot of news stations and quite a lot of other documentarians out there, and a lot of the time they were asking questions that just kind of elicited what they believed. So we believe this scripture and that scripture, and there's going to be so ever many days until the end of the world. But we were really interested in how did it feel to believe these things? How did you come to believe those things? What change, what does it mean, and what change did it bring? So we were asking kind of different questions, really, and not kind of having the attitude of we're out on the outside looking down or looking at these people, but rather just sort of being amongst them, to be honest.
Right. And then so you also included scientists, neuroscientists, who looked at what happens in the brain when we have a belief. What did you find? What did the scientists find?
Yeah, so that was a study at UCLA about what believe in something, what disbelieve in something looks like on the level of the brain. And so they got a group of people who believed in God and a group of people who didn't believe in God, and asked them a series of questions. What they found was that believing on the kind of, I guess, the physiological level of the brain seems to have a particular signature, and that's irrespective of what you believe.
Are scientists susceptible to their own succumbing to this type of delusion?
Oh, right. I mean, to be fair, there were people who were scientists who believed in May 20. We came across a physicist, who believed in this. We spoke to a physicist in sort of very high position,
Wow.
who believed in this, and another sort of PhD student who believed in this. And I think scientists themselves would recognise that actually science is not free from conviction, or free from sort of holding particular positions. But I guess the principle in science is that you hold those things and you continue to test them, and then you show whether they're right or wrong, and you have them peer reviewed and things like that. So I think the thing is that we can all succumb to ideas that others might describe as being odd, or maybe even dangerous. And so I think it's across humankind that we are vulnerable to holding ideas that are maybe not correct and maybe not helpful, and have to be aware of what's the impact of this stuff that I'm believing, what's the impact of me sharing these ideas with other people. Another part of the film that we've not spoken too much about is this idea of kind of cognitive dissonance. Wow. And so the social psychologists, Elliot Aronson and Cavell Tavares, they've written a great book, by the way, called Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me. Yeah, it's really entertaining. Yeah. It's really entertaining, but kind of has lots of sort of home truths to consider. And so most of us see ourselves as kind of, better than average, smarter than average, that we're ethical, that we're good, human beings. And when the information comes up that kind of shows that maybe we're not that ethical, or good, or maybe we're not as smart as what we thought, we can experience cognitive dissonance. So there's this discomfort, and they liken it to kind of, being thirsty, or to kind of hunger or thirst. And it's a discomfort that we want to get away from quite quickly. And there's different ways that we can respond to that, which is either we say that the evidence is wrong, you're wrong, I'm right. Sometimes people might over identify with being wrong, oh, I'm such a bad person, and that can sometimes be equally, disabling, not very helpful. And maybe a more constructive way is to say, okay, what I did was wrong, or the belief that I had was wrong. What can I do to put it right? And what can I do to make sure that I don't do that again? And so that's really the helpful stuff that we got from the learnings that social psychology has made around this area of how we believe.
It makes me wonder how personality then plays into that. What determines how you'll respond? Which of the three approaches you'll take to an issue? I think, because now there's a lot of conversation happening around identity and whether it's important for our psychology, if it's healthy to have an identity, and if you don't, if it's healthy to not have a firm identity, and sort of, my own experiences have forced me to be open. So my dad would lean into religion and say, look, in Islam, we believe, we don't believe in the idea of race. We believe that everybody is, a creation of God. And and this is all God's earth, and he'll decide how your journey evolves. And so that answer for me was sufficient. So much of my experience in life, my learning came from interactions and not reading and being told what to think. Did you find that, that there was the way people were interacting at that time was influenced by social media?
That's such a good question. In terms of social media, the thing that people were involved in a lot at that time, because it was quite a while ago, was basically online. So there were groups online but many people were not. And in a way, these people were kind of, we were speaking to a couple of economists who had done some research with May 21 believers, who are also in the film, and they were saying, in a way, these guys are heroes because they are really going against the grain. They were not. There was no kind of physical. I mean, they met up on there was a kind of a group of people that would meet up on a Sunday, and Harold Camping would sort of do some teaching, but they didn't believe in church, and so a lot of these people were by themselves in their communities, and would only be, like the only person in the family to believe this stuff, so they really went against the grain, and there was no sort of they might kind of meet up with other believers occasionally, but they didn't have that kind of constant reinforcement, because they weren't a group of people who were separated from society, listening to one person, in a kind of cult situation. They were regular people who had regular jobs, and were surrounded by people who didn't believe what they believed, were surrounded by family who were kind of really, who they kind of alienated some of the time by having this belief. So oftentimes having this belief was a cost for the people who believed in it, and they were definitely not they wouldn't have the social media support that, let's say maybe extreme right people might have today, by any means. So your idea of maybe, or one, the kind of, having your identity in God as opposed to, a social identity necessarily, or primarily a social identity, might have contributed to that kind of strength. And also the fact that this belief or these ideas seem to fit together, so they could look at it and it fits together, and so for them it was, their evidence, and it was objective, it was outside of them, they could show it and explain it to somebody, so it's interesting, that idea of how or the fact that actually social media didn't have such a strong role with this group of people at that time, and how in lots of their circumstances they were going against the grain.
Wow, that's really interesting because it throws up a lot of questions. I mean, right now, so much of what we see is blamed on social media, that people have these ways of organizing into groups, into silos that just affirm and reaffirm their beliefs. But maybe that's what they had in the real life with their groups when he's handing out flyers and leaflets. Isn't that an affirmation um, that reinforces the same beliefs, right?
Yeah, well, I guess in terms of the social psychology of it all, I'm standing on Hollywood and Highland giving out leaflets. I'm not a stupid person. I'm not a wicked person. So therefore, what I'm doing must be right. I've got reasons to do this.
Yeah.
So that kind of self-concept that most of us have, that we're better than average, we're smarter than average, we're good, we're ethical people, means that we can justify stuff that we do. And sometimes even go down the side of a pyramid where you end up doing stuff that maybe in hindsight is a little bit, you would never imagine yourself doing, but because of how the brain works, we can, psychologically, we can find ourselves in situations that we would never have imagined ourselves as being in.
Yeah. This is so fascinating because there's a part of me that doesn't want to see how fatalistic this all is, because it almost feels like we have a physical brain that we pretty much can't control, that could fall for any sorts of ideas that could lead us off in dangerous paths at any time.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because one of the ladies says in the film, I thought myself as a sensible person, that I would never fall for something like this, and yet it happened. But what the social psychologists say is that what's helpful is to, we all have beliefs, we all have convictions, and to hold them light enough so that when evidence comes along to show that it's not correct, to basically give them up. And so I think for me personally, I've never really had a problem with speaking to people who disagree with me, who believe stuff that is completely different to what I believe. In a way, I kind of I enjoy it, and I think it's a good thing to be around people who disagree with you. Sometimes they can point out stuff that is actually just not true, or get you to think about stuff that you take for granted. So I mean, and that's one of the benefits of growing up in London. I'm a Londoner. All the schools that I went to were really mixed. We had also different people from different backgrounds, and people from different religions and stuff. So that's, I think for me, that's been really helpful in kind of not training me, but it just means that I've grown up in a culture where we accept different people. Yeah, but I mean, but going back to your question, the point being that we don't need to be fearful that we will end up believing crazy stuff. Most people, or things that are really out there. I think most people don't. But knowing how cognitive dissonance works, knowing about the idea of the pyramid is a really helpful one. So I remember a friend of mine saying, I got into this situation and I could just see myself going down the pyramid, and when I realized that, I pulled out of it. I pulled myself back up. And so sometimes knowing how these things are helpful analogies.
Absolutely.
Right? They're not gospel, but they're just helpful ways of thinking and understanding things that can help us hopefully not fall into traps, or maybe not and also kind of behave in a way towards other people that won't force them to become stronger in their beliefs. So for example, if you're discussing something with somebody and you're attacking them and you're not listening to them, because we have this kind of, sometimes what we believe can be caught up in our identity, and sometimes maybe self-worth, that maybe that kind of aggressive attitude of wanting to prove somebody wrong isn't the most helpful. I found that sometimes when people have with me been a bit more kind of, okay, oh, I hear you, and asking questions, then that kind of creates a space where I can go and think like, well, actually, yeah, I said that, but is that really sensible? Is that true? Maybe that's wrong. Maybe I need to give that one up. And so kind of creating spaces where where at the heart of it, you're not out there to get people, but you're there you separate the person from what they believe in. Sometimes can be a helpful way forward in discussions. Yeah, I mean, we all make mistakes, right? I'm sure, I still have arguments with people, but knowing this stuff is helpful, and also saying sorry is a good thing. I mean, when we're kind of talking about person to person interaction.
Absolutely. I think there's something to be said for understanding how the brain works, and for also all of us maybe trying to learn how to think instead of what to think. I don't know what you think of that.
I think that's really, really helpful. Realizing how we think, and maybe being able to, or having the tools to kind of think critically. Yeah, I guess discern sort of beliefs that we hold, that are ideas that we kind of take for granted and aren't necessarily true.
Yeah.
Or maybe, are no longer true.
Yeah.
And there might be some ideas that are perennially correct, but yeah, just having that understanding and thinking about thinking.
And also maybe giving each other the space to say, I was wrong. And then we practice saying it. I was wrong. I didn't know what I was talking about. I was under a lot of stress, and kind of giving each other space and grace to be able to apologize and dig our way back. Can you talk to us about some of the characters who had the most cognitive dissonance, and what you witnessed in terms of them coming to grips with the fact that they were under a spell almost?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that in a way they weren't under a spell, because they had this evidence in front of them that seemed to fit together. And according to their frame of reference in terms of the ideas of on which this evidence was based, they could believe it as kind of rational, objective people. And so actually, when it didn't happen, a lot of them were sort of really, they felt a lot of cognitive dissonance, and people would call us and oh, have you heard from whatever, have you heard from this person, have you heard from that person, what's going on, and so there was a lot of cognitive dissonance about, and what we see in the film is how Harold Campin deals with his cognitive dissonance, and I think that's really interesting. But it's also interesting to know that actually, beyond the film and afterwards, and just before he passed away, that the organisation sort of released a statement saying that they were wrong, and that they were wrong to make that prediction, and that people should treat them as an example not to make predictions about the end of the world.
Oh,
so,
wow.
Yeah, so as an organisation, at first that wasn't his, response, but eventually, he and the organisation came out and said, we was wrong. Don't do what we did.
But then again, it comes back to that point, because hadn't he made a similar prediction?
Yes, he did.
Prior to the
yeah. No, absolutely, yeah. And it's in the film as well. 1994, Louis Theroux had visited Family Radio back then. Yeah, so he had made other predictions, and the way that he got out of the May 21 not happening, which you'll see in the film, I imagine is not massively dissimilar to how it was reconciled, before. How it was reconciled before. But actually, as a radio station, I mean, that's a too long a story actually. But it was interesting to know that a lot of people at the radio station didn't believe in May 21 actually. But they were kind of faithful to the radio station that had existed for a long time, and they'd kind of grown up with the radio station and had worked for the radio and the television station when, pre the belief in the end of the world. And they saw that a lot of Christians had left the radio station because they weren't happy with Harold Campin's predictions, but they wanted to stay to tell others, new people that would come in, that this is wrong, you shouldn't believe this. And so it was a very strange dynamic actually being there, that the leader of this organization believed in this thing, but a lot of people who worked for the radio station, for the, you know, broadcast, for the, you know, organization, you know, at the location, didn't believe in it.
Right. And so they kind of just stayed for a paycheck?
No, not a paycheck. They stayed there because they wanted the station to regain its integrity. So they wanted this thing to go away, so that things would, you know, so that it would be just that regular, you know, low key Christian radio station and television station that just kind of put out, you know, Christian messages and sent out, you know, literature for free to people who, you know, could be encouraged in their faith or wanted to know more about faith. So no, it wasn't a paycheck. I think it was more a moral stand, that they didn't want to be, you know, so many other people had left, but there's now nobody there to kind of tell the truth of what this organization was, and that actually, you know, they didn't believe in May 21.
That's really interesting. What I take away is that when you come to have a belief, is to take pause and try and test it. Try and test how true your belief is. And also be careful about the beliefs and the things that you're spreading, and not to be aware of the impact that that could have on someone's life. Did he truly, sincerely believe that that was the date, because based on his calculations?
Yeah. Based on the calculations that he could show other people. Yeah, it kind of fit together. So he really believed it. Yeah. Sorry?
He was just trying to save them.
Yeah, I mean, he felt that he had a duty to, you know, to spread the word and to warn the world so that they could be saved as well. So, you know, so he kind of understood that from his reading of the Bible, that, you know, that it was right to warn others so that they could be saved, that was the right and moral thing to do.
Did he have his brain tested by the scientists?
No way. He would not have agreed to do that. He was too busy. Yeah, they put all their resources in spreading this word. So all of the money of the radio station they put into
millions, right? Of hundreds of thousands, a huge sum. Just
yeah, because they believed it, and so all of that money was kind of, you know, put into doing billboards. You know, they had RVs where families would go, or people would go to different states to warn the world. I think they even had some missions abroad, you know. So yeah, and there was a poster in I think London Underground at some point that I saw. I mean, just the one, but you know, so there was they had a few. Yeah, they put their resources into getting the message out there.
I really want to understand how we come to believe things that aren't tested, and I have to come back to that thing of certainty, the fear that we hold as humans, being the only species that is aware that our time on earth is limited, that the fear that we get to either die and leave behind those we love, or lose people we love when they die. And I think that must play a big part in how we exist in the world, you know, why we need all these things that give us a sense of security.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a big question beyond me, but very interesting. Yeah, for sure. And I guess, like, in terms of you know, we know now that a lot of the algorithms you know, going around the internet tends to bring us things that we agree with. You know, I mean, I guess that they get paid from our attention, right? And so they're not going to send things to us that we're not going to want to read because they don't agree with what we believe. And
they're giving us whatever basically is going to keep us engaged the longest.
Absolutely, yeah. So the things that we believe already, probably.
I morally struggle with this, just even in creating content, because I feel like there's so much other content that I could create that is, I think, more profitable, more clickbaity, more But again, it comes back to my own ethics and feeling that, I'm asking somebody to give me time, an hour of their time. What do they get out of this conversation?
Yeah.
And I can't guarantee that I'm telling them anything interesting, anything new, but this was helpful to me. So that's why I try and at least make sure that what I'm, as much as I can.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I guess it's taking responsibility, isn't it? What are the consequences of what you say, of what you put out there? How is that going to be translated? How is that going to be applied by people who receive what you put out there? So yeah, I mean, I guess it's a question of responsibility, that what we do makes a difference to someone somewhere.
Yeah, this is why I really think people should watch this film. This is an independent film. It costs less than a croissant. I think one of the things I learned from this was not to live life as if life is short, but what would it mean if life is really long? So I have a neighbor who's 103 years old. She just turned 103. And I always think, if I live as long as her, what am I going to regret? I'm thinking, okay, you know what, COVID is going to be the end of the world, or this is going to be the end of the world. You end up taking certain actions and you end up being inactive in certain ways. But if you think, actually, what if it's a century that I get to live?
Yeah.
You live differently.
And one of the things that occurred to me is that you really need to curate your beliefs, what you believe. So for example, if you believe that, I don't know, something random, like people don't like you or people don't love you or whatever, that may shape how you then treat people, and like maybe when you get a little bit older, where we don't, I mean, I don't know what happens to the brain when we get a little bit older, but maybe we become less guarded, and we have less, I don't know, maybe the things that we take for granted become more part of who we are. It would be really interesting to hear a social psychologist or a psychologist to sort of explain a bit more about what happens to the brain when we're a little bit older. But I think that sometimes, ideas, truths that we hold in our mind when we're young can really come to haunt us when we're a little bit older, and influence the way that we treat people, and maybe it becomes harder to get rid of ideas that are not actually very helpful or not very conducive to good, nurturing human relationships. And so so just kind of being just more aware of older people has made me sort of think about that you really need to take stock of what you believe, what you believe.
But also I find, what I'm realizing is, because of the role that religion, the minimal role that religion now plays in people's lives. I mean, our parents spent a lot of time thinking about the spiritual aspects of life and how their souls were evolving, and previous generations. But that's not a main focus, I think, in modern life. And that I might be wrong, but I think that is at the root of a lot of that lack of reflection, that lack of contemplation, affects how we evolve through and deal with the challenges that we are facing. And so this film has really made me think differently. So, for example, even about beliefs and faith, like, I've realized that I'm more of a faithful person than I am a believing one, because and I think there's a difference. You can tell me if I'm wrong, but the difference for me is faith requires you to be comfortable with the uncertainty, and move through life with hopeful, because there's no guarantee. Whereas believing is almost clinging to. Whenever I try to have beliefs, I find physically on me it's draining.
And I think what is more sort of in I don't know, culture these days is the idea that the things that we believe can have an impact on how we feel. And that kind of becoming dogmatic or having a particular belief, sort of you're aware that it affects you in a particular way. I think what was also interesting about the film, in terms of its impact, is just the different stories and different experiences that people bring to it. So for you, it kind of touched you in terms of faith and belief. And there was a lady, for example, we did a screening in San Francisco, and she said that actually, because of climate change, she went off grid for about 10 years, and was just kind of coming back to, I don't know, to society, if you were, and she was now going to do a master's or something in psychology or something like that. But it was really interesting to hear how her belief in climate change impacted her life for that amount of time, and then her kind of coming back to modern life that I feel she felt she needed to sort of come back. And so that's another thing that I've loved about the film, that the example is out there enough for people to capture the ideas and apply it to their specific situation.